The ambient hum of low chatter and the clinking of glasses filled the luxurious dining room of Le Jardin, a famed New York restaurant known for attracting the city's elite. Henry Ashton, a man in his mid-50s with a tailored suit and a cold, calculating gaze, sipped his scotch, basking in the success of his latest venture. The merger had gone through, and with it, he'd added millions more to his already staggering wealth. Yet, as he sat alone at his usual table, he felt a familiar emptiness creeping in, like a shadow hovering just beyond his reach. Henry leaned back, allowing his eyes to wander across the room. That's when he noticed her, a woman seated near the kitchen, looking profoundly out of place. She wore a plain coat, her hair pulled back in a haphazard bun, and she held her purse tightly in her lap. Her face, though lovely, was marked by lines of worry, and her hands trembled ever so slightly as she glanced around nervously. Henry's curiosity was piqued. In a world where appearances meant everything, her presence was almost a mystery. He watched as a waiter approached her table, placing the bill discreetly before her. The woman's eyes widened, and she bit her lip, fumbling through her purse. It was clear that she was short on cash, and as the waiter began to frown, she rose from her seat, a mix of embarrassment and anxiety flashing across her face. Just as she was about to leave, Henry stood up, his hand raised in a gesture that halted the waiter. "I'll cover her bill," he said, his voice calm yet authoritative. The waiter hesitated, but a nod from Henry was all he needed to retreat, leaving the woman stunned and speechless. The woman approached his table, hesitant but determined. Her eyes, a striking shade of blue that seemed out of place against her tired expression, met his with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I'm not looking for handouts." "It's not a handout," Henry replied, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Consider it a gesture from a stranger who understands what it's like to be caught off guard." She looked at him, visibly surprised. For a moment, they held each other's gaze, and Henry felt something stir within him, a flicker of humanity he'd long buried under years of wealth and ambition. She nodded, murmured another thank you, and turned to leave, but not before adding, "I'll find a way to repay you someday." As she walked away, Henry felt an odd sense of loss, as though something significant had slipped through his fingers. He watched her disappear through the restaurant's heavy doors, left alone with a bill that meant nothing to him, yet held an unexpected weight. For the first time in years, Henry Ashton found himself intrigued. Not by a business deal, not by a potential acquisition, but by a stranger who had left him with a question he couldn't answer. Henry hadn't expected to see her again, but weeks after the restaurant encounter, there she was, standing by the elevator in the lobby of Ashton Charities. The familiar shape of her face, the steady but tired look in her blue eyes. It was unmistakably the same woman. She looked just as surprised as he felt, freezing for a brief moment before offering him a polite, almost shy nod. "Mr. Ashton," she murmured. Henry nodded back, his usual mask of indifference slipping slightly. He cleared his throat. "So, what brings you to Ashton Charities?" His voice held a trace of genuine curiosity, a rare tone for a man who seldom cared for personal details. She hesitated, clearly weighing her response. I just started working here. Part-time, in the administration office. Just enough to pay the bills, really." Henry felt a strange pang, a mix of intrigue and something he couldn't quite name. She looked as though she was carrying the weight of years on her shoulders, a stark contrast to the wealthy executives and privileged assistants he was used to encountering. "What's your name?" he asked, surprised by his own question. "Annie," she said, offering him a small, almost hesitant smile. "Annie Foster." "Annie Foster," he repeated, as if testing the weight of her name in his mouth. It was simple, unpretentious, just like the woman standing before him. "Welcome to Ashton Charities, Annie." For a moment, they stood in silence, and Henry found himself unable to look away from her. There was a quiet strength about her, a dignity that seemed incongruous with the humble circumstances in which he'd first met her. She wasn't polished or self-assured like the people he typically associated with. Instead, she seemed grounded, real in a way he hadn't encountered in years. The elevator doors opened, and Henry stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. As they rode up in silence, he found himself acutely aware of her presence, of the calm aura she radiated. For once, the usual buzz of his mind quieted. Over the next few weeks, Henry caught glimpses of Annie here and there, often in passing. She would be carrying files down the hall or quietly working at her desk near the back of the administration office. Despite the hum of voices and the shuffle of feet around them, it was as if an invisible thread connected them. His gaze would find her across the room almost instinctively, and she would offer him a nod or a faint smile. Gradually, their interactions grew. He found excuses to speak with her, lingering by her desk under the guise of discussing foundation matters. Their conversation started simple, polite questions about her work, her thoughts on the foundation's outreach programs. But bit by bit, Annie began to open up, sharing small pieces of her life, like how she lived in a small apartment in Queens, or how she was raising her teenage son alone. Henry listened more than he spoke, fascinated by the resilience in her stories. Annie had been through so much, losing her husband to an accident, battling financial struggles, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Yet, despite it all, there was no bitterness in her voice, no hint of self-pity. Instead, she spoke with a quiet strength that made Henry question his own life, his choices, and the endless chase for more. One rainy afternoon, he found her sitting alone in the break room, a distant look in her eyes as she sipped a cup of coffee. Henry hesitated at the door, then walked over and sat across from her. "Long day?" he asked, offering her a rare, warm smile. She chuckled softly, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. "You could say that. I've had a few of those in my life. Why here, Annie?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. "Why Ashton Charities? You could probably find something closer to home, maybe less stressful." Annie looked down, running her fingers along the rim of her cup. "I suppose. I wanted to work somewhere that does more than just make money," she said quietly. "I know it sounds naive, but I thought maybe I could make a difference here, even if it's just a small one." Henry was struck by her sincerity, by the stark contrast between her outlook and his own cynicism. For him, Ashton Charities had always been a way to polish his reputation, a shield against public criticism. But Annie's intentions were untainted, and somehow, that made him feel exposed, as if she could see right through the layers he'd built to protect himself. "Not naive at all," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. "In fact, it's refreshing." Annie looked up, her gaze steady. For the first time, he noticed the flecks of green in her blue eyes, a warmth that seemed to draw him in. She smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that tugged at something deep within him. In that moment, Henry realized he'd been wrong about people like her. She wasn't weak or desperate. She was resilient, grounded by values he'd long forgotten. And somehow, her presence was beginning to fill the hollow spaces within him, as though he'd stumbled upon something he'd been searching for without knowing it. The spell was broken when her phone buzzed, and she glanced down, her face softening as she read a message. "My son," she explained, an unmistakable warmth in her voice. "He's wondering when I'll be home." As she stood to leave, Henry found himself reluctant to watch her go. "Annie," he called out, unsure of what he wanted to say. She paused, looking back with that same steady gaze. "If you ever need anything, I'm here." She smiled again, a gentle nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. Ashton, but I think I'll be just fine." As she walked away, Henry felt an ache, a strange, unexpected longing for something he couldn't quite define. And for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to be a better man, if only to be worthy of her gaze. As the weeks passed, Henry couldn't ignore the changes stirring within him. The drive for deals and the next acquisition, once the heart of his ambition, had started to pale, replaced by a growing curiosity about Annie's life. Each fragment she shared felt like a puzzle piece to a story he didn't fully understand but was desperate to complete. He'd never met anyone quite like her. She was strong, yet vulnerable, with a quiet resilience that both humbled and unsettled him. One evening, as the day's work wrapped up and the last of the employees filed out, Henry noticed Annie lingering by the copier, struggling with a jammed machine. She wore a weary expression, one that spoke of more than just a long day at the office. Henry walked over, hands casually in his pockets. "Need a hand?" he asked, leaning down to inspect the copier. Annie chuckled softly. "I think this machine and I are in a battle of wills," she sighed, a tired but genuine smile lifting her face. "It wins more often than I'd like to admit." They shared a quiet laugh, and for a moment, the stiffness of work titles and roles melted away, leaving just two people with no need for masks. With a deft click, Henry managed to dislodge the jam, handing her the neatly printed pages with a slight bow. "There you go." "Thank you, Mr. Ashton," she replied, taking the papers gratefully. "You've saved me more frustration than you know." "Please," he corrected her, "call me Henry." She hesitated, then nodded. "Henry," she said, as if testing the weight of his name for the first time. Her smile faded, and she looked down at the papers in her hands, a hint of sadness crossing her face. "Something on your mind?" he asked, careful not to pry but genuinely curious. Annie took a deep breath, her eyes distant. Well, sometimes I forget how different my life is now. There was a time when everything was easier." She paused, then glanced up at him, as if debating whether or not to continue. "My husband and I had a quiet life. It wasn't much, but it was ours." Henry listened intently, his usual sharp gaze softening as she spoke. Annie's husband had been a mechanic with a modest shop in a small town upstate. They had met young, and though life had thrown them its fair share of challenges, they had built a life on love, laughter, and trust. But 2 years ago, everything changed. One rainy evening, a car accident had claimed her husband's life, leaving Annie alone to raise their son. As she spoke, her voice wavered, but she steadied herself, pushing through the painful memories. She described the sleepless nights, the relentless bills, and the gut-wrenching moment she realized she'd have to sell their small home. She had moved to New York with her son, hoping to start over, but the city was harsh and unyielding, a place where people like her often went unseen. Henry felt a tightness in his chest as he listened. He could hardly imagine what it would be like to lose everything in the blink of an eye. He, who'd spent his life amassing wealth and influence, had never faced the kind of raw, relentless hardship Annie had. And yet, she stood before him, unbroken, with a dignity that took his breath away. "You must miss him," he said softly, surprising himself with the tenderness in his voice. Annie nodded, her eyes glistening. "Every day. But my son needs me to be strong." "So I am." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I don't expect sympathy, Henry. Life doesn't always give us a choice." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. They both fell silent, the quiet hum of the office a backdrop to the unspoken bond forming between them. It wasn't pity he felt for her. It was admiration, a deep respect for a woman who had faced life's brutalities and still held her head high. After a moment, Annie gathered herself, wiping away the lone tear that had slipped free. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to unload all that on you." "No need to apologize," Henry replied, his voice steady but softened. "I appreciate you trusting me with it." Annie gave him a small smile, gratitude flickering in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a struggling single mother or a widow trying to get by, but simply as herself. As she turned to leave, Henry felt an impulse to prolong the moment, to keep her from vanishing into the night. "Annie," he called after her. She paused, looking back with that same quiet strength. Would you be open to grabbing a coffee sometime? Just to talk." She hesitated, visibly caught off guard. "I don't know, Henry. I'm not sure what people would think." "Who cares what people think?" he replied, an unexpected hint of defiance in his tone. "Sometimes we need someone to talk to." She studied him, her gaze softening as if she were seeing beyond the billionaire exterior, into the man who was finally letting his guard down. "All right," she said quietly. "Maybe one coffee wouldn't hurt." Henry felt a small, uncharacteristic thrill at her acceptance, as if he'd been given a gift he didn't deserve. They arranged to meet the following week, and as Annie walked out of the building, he found himself watching her until she disappeared from sight. He felt something new, a quiet, persistent yearning for the life she had described, one that wasn't measured by wealth or power but by love and resilience. For the first time, he wondered if he'd spent his life climbing the wrong mountain, reaching the top only to realize he was alone. And in the weeks that followed, he found himself returning to that thought again and again, unable to shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Henry couldn't shake the impact of Annie's story. Her resilience had a way of echoing in his mind, challenging him to re-examine the path he'd taken. His days at the office felt different now, his routine meetings and acquisitions all strangely muted. Every achievement, every zero on his balance sheet, every transaction that once thrilled him now seemed empty. Annie's presence, her quiet strength, her humble pride, her ability to carry on despite it all, lingered in his thoughts. He'd never thought of himself as lonely. After all, he was always surrounded by people, assistants, partners, clients, and competitors. And yet, in his vast penthouse or the sleek offices of Ashton Charities, a hollow silence had crept in, filling every corner. When he finally acknowledged it, the admission felt both uncomfortable and oddly liberating. He was lonely, but he was also beginning to realize that he no longer had to be. Their coffee meetup came on a clear Wednesday afternoon. Henry chose a small, unpretentious cafe, far from his usual high-end haunts. When Annie arrived, he felt an inexplicable sense of relief, as if her presence brought warmth into the sterile environment. She was dressed simply, in a worn jacket and a modest scarf, her cheeks flushed from the brisk autumn air. "Thanks for meeting me," he greeted her, offering an awkward smile. Annie smiled back, a bit hesitant. "It's not what I expected from you, to be honest. Coffee or meeting with me?" he replied with a chuckle. "Both, actually." Her laugh was soft, genuine, and Henry found himself smiling, the lines of tension easing from his face. They ordered, and as they settled into their small corner table, Henry realized he had no idea where to start. His usual conversational skills, used to cut deals, win negotiations, and impress investors, felt useless. Instead, he asked her the question that had been burning in his mind. "Do you ever regret moving to New York?" His voice was quiet, almost vulnerable. "After everything you've been through?" Annie took a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I've thought about that a lot," she said, her gaze fixed on her cup. "At first, it was hard. I felt lost, like the city was swallowing me whole. But," she looked up, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze, "my son needed a fresh start, and maybe I did too." Henry nodded, absorbing her words. He hadn't expected such honesty, and it unsettled him how much her answer mirrored the questions in his own heart. "What about you?" she asked, surprising him. "Have you always wanted all this?" She gestured vaguely, as if trying to encapsulate his world of wealth, power, and influence. He hesitated. No one ever asked him that. People assumed he was exactly where he wanted to be, on top. But sitting across from Annie, he found himself compelled to be honest. "Once I thought I did," he admitted. "I grew up without much, so I believed that wealth was everything. I thought if I climbed high enough, got rich enough, I'd be, I don't know, invincible." He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "I realize now how foolish that was. I have everything, yet sometimes it feels like I have nothing." Annie's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Sometimes we chase things that we think will make us happy, only to realize they don't," she said gently. "The world tells us what we should want, but rarely asks what we truly need." Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating in a way that nothing else ever had. He found himself opening up, sharing more than he'd ever intended. He told her about his family, about how his pursuit of wealth had distanced him from his siblings, his parents, even the friends he'd once had. He'd sacrificed connection for power, trading love for ambition, and though he hadn't understood it at the time, he was finally beginning to see the cost. Annie listened with a quiet intensity, her gaze never wavering. She didn't judge him, didn't offer pity or empty platitudes. Instead, she simply nodded, her silence a testament to her empathy and understanding. In her presence, he felt strangely free free to be vulnerable, to be himself without the need to impress or prove anything. They finished their coffee, and as they stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk, a comfortable silence fell between them. Henry felt as if he'd shed a part of his old self, like shedding an old suit that no longer fit. He hadn't felt this light in years. As they walked, he glanced over at her, feeling a newfound respect for the woman beside him. She wasn't wealthy, powerful, or influential, yet her strength was undeniable. Her values and her sense of purpose had a solidity that he envied. "Thank you, Annie," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "for listening, for seeing me." She looked up at him, her blue eyes warm. "Everyone deserves to be seen, Henry," she replied, "especially those who think they don't need it." They reached her subway stop, and she turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Take care, Henry," she said softly, her hand lingering briefly on his arm. "Sometimes, we don't realize the weight we're carrying until we let it go." He nodded, watching her descend the steps, feeling as if a part of himself was going with her. When she disappeared from sight, he was left standing alone, surrounded by the rush of the city, but feeling a profound stillness within. For the first time in years, Henry Ashton felt an unfamiliar but comforting sense of hope. It wasn't the aggressive, ambitious hope of youth, but something gentler, steadier, rooted in the possibility of becoming the kind of man he wanted to be. And as he walked back to his office, he realized that he was ready to change, not just for himself, but for someone who had given him a glimpse of what life could be if he chose to live it differently. As fall set in, the days grew shorter, and a crisp chill filled the New York air. Henry found himself looking forward to work with an excitement he hadn't felt in years, and the reason was simple: Annie. She had become a quiet but constant presence in his life, offering him a perspective he'd never considered before. One afternoon, Henry received word that Ashton Charities was hosting a new initiative, an outreach program designed to assist underprivileged families in New York. He'd approved the project weeks earlier, seeing it as another checkbox in his corporate social responsibility goals. But now, with Annie in his life, this project felt different. He wanted her input, to involve her in a way that felt genuine. He called her to his office. When she arrived, she looked slightly nervous, her fingers twisting the strap of her worn leather bag. Henry gestured for her to sit, offering her a smile meant to put her at ease. "Annie, I wanted to get your thoughts on this new outreach program," he began. "I know you're new here, but I feel you have an insight that could be valuable." She blinked, clearly surprised. "My insight? I'm not sure I have much to offer, Henry. I've never worked in anything like this before." "Precisely," he replied, leaning forward. "You know what it's like to face real hardship, to struggle. That's something I don't have, but you do. I want this project to be more than just a PR effort. I want it to mean something." Her gaze softened as she nodded, and Henry could see her shift from hesitant to thoughtful. She glanced down at the folder he'd placed on the table, filled with data, proposals, and budgets. After a moment, she spoke. "Henry, if you want to make a real difference, we need to focus on practical help, things that actually ease a family's burden. Financial aid is important, but sometimes it's the simple things, like meals, clothing, or even just a safe place for children to go after school. I'd suggest starting there." Her insight hit home, and Henry felt a rush of gratitude. Here she was, providing guidance that cut straight to the heart of the matter, unclouded by numbers or financial projections. Together, they sketched out a plan that went beyond corporate charity and reached for something more meaningful. He watched her as she leaned over the table, pointing to areas she believed needed the most help, her eyes lighting up with a passion that was contagious. For the first time, Henry felt a spark of real purpose within his company. Over the next few weeks, Henry and Annie worked side by side, meeting with community leaders, reviewing grant proposals, and even visiting schools and shelters to understand where the foundation's resources could do the most good. Henry was used to overseeing projects from afar, but Annie's approach was hands-on, and he found himself pulled into it, compelled by her warmth and empathy. On a chilly Friday afternoon, they visited a community center in the Bronx. The building was old, the paint peeling, and the heating sporadic, but the warmth of the staff and the families gathered there made it feel welcoming. Annie seemed to come alive as she interacted with the children, laughing with them, listening to their stories, and offering comforting words to their parents. Watching her, Henry realized that he was witnessing something profoundly beautiful, an authenticity and kindness that went beyond anything he had ever known. A young boy approached him, tugging at his coat. "Are you Miss Annie's friend?" he asked, his big brown eyes staring up at Henry. Startled, Henry looked down, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, I suppose I am." The boy grinned. "Miss Annie is the nicest person here. She always brings us books and cookies." Henry chuckled, looking over at Annie, who was in deep conversation with a mother nearby. "She's pretty special, isn't she?" The boy nodded emphatically, his admiration for Annie clear. Henry felt a surge of pride, coupled with a growing realization that he wanted to be the kind of person these children looked up to. He wanted to be worthy of their trust and of Annie's. Later that evening, as they left the center, Henry walked alongside Annie in thoughtful silence. She glanced at him, sensing the change in his demeanor. "You seem different tonight," she observed. He hesitated, then nodded. "I guess I am," he admitted. "I never realized how much good could come from being directly involved. I've spent my life so distant, removed from people like this, people like you." Annie's cheeks flushed, but she offered him a warm smile. "People like me?" "Yes," he replied, his voice low and sincere. "People who are strong, who care deeply, who make a difference even when no one's watching." They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of the city a backdrop to the weight of the moment. Henry stopped, turning to face her. "Annie, I don't think I've ever felt this connected to anyone or anything before." Her gaze softened, and she reached out, touching his arm. "Henry, you're finally allowing yourself to see people, not as assets or resources, but as people. That's where connection begins." Her words struck deep, and for the first time, Henry realized that he was no longer just admiring her. He was falling in love with her. Annie wasn't merely someone who inspired him. She was becoming the heartbeat of his newfound purpose, the anchor he never knew he needed. As they stood on the corner, bathed in the glow of the streetlights, Henry knew that this was more than just a project, more than just charity. This was his chance to start over, to build something real, rooted in compassion and guided by love. They parted ways, but Henry carried a quiet, powerful certainty within him. He was going to make a difference, not just for the people they aimed to help, but for Annie and for himself. And as he walked back to his penthouse that night, he felt lighter, as if he'd shed the weight of years spent climbing a mountain he no longer wished to stand atop. Henry's transformation wasn't lost on those around him. His colleagues noticed a new sense of purpose in his actions, a shift from the cold businessman they'd known to a man driven by something deeper. And yet, despite the positive changes, an old shadow was lurking in the wings, waiting to disrupt everything he'd built. One evening, Henry received an unexpected visitor, Martin Krause, an old business partner from the early days of his career. They had parted ways years ago under tense circumstances, and Henry had not thought of Martin in years. Now, sitting across from him in Henry's glass-walled office, Martin wore an odd expression, one that sent a prickling sensation of unease down Henry's spine. "It's been a long time, Henry," Martin said, folding his hands across his lap, his voice low and measured. "Too long, some might say," Henry replied coolly, his guard up. He didn't like surprises, and Martin's sudden visit felt like one. Martin studied him, a glint of something bitter in his eyes. "I've been following your work with Ashton Charities," he continued, his tone laced with irony. "All this philanthropy. It's quite the transformation." Henry bristled. "People change, Martin." "I've grown." "Perhaps," Martin murmured, glancing down as he adjusted the cufflinks on his suit. Then, he looked back up, his eyes sharp. "But have you told Annie Foster about the legacy of your growth?" Henry froze. The mention of Annie's name felt like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tight. Henry, I always knew you were a clever man," Martin said, leaning back with a smug expression. "But let me refresh your memory. Years ago, when we were expanding into new markets, there was a small town upstate where we set up operations. A factory." Henry's mind raced. a growing dread filling him as the memories began to resurface. "You remember now, don't you?" Martin continued, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "The factory discharged waste into the nearby river. A lot of people got sick, and property values plummeted. People lost everything. The town never recovered, and neither did the people." Henry felt a sickening realization dawn on him. That factory, that town. He had signed off on those decisions without a second thought, treating them as collateral damage in his rise to power. And now he was beginning to connect the dots. "What does this have to do with Annie?" he whispered, barely able to contain his horror. Martin chuckled, as if enjoying the moment. Annie's husband was one of the people affected, Henry. He lost his job, his health deteriorated, and eventually, they lost their home. That's why she had to leave. She and her son barely survived. The room felt like it was spinning. Henry's mind raced back to every conversation he'd had with Annie, every story she'd shared about her late husband and the hardships they endured. All this time, he'd admired her resilience, her strength in the face of adversity, never knowing that he was the source of her suffering. Martin's voice cut through his shock. "I thought you'd want to know. After all, honesty is the backbone of redemption, isn't it?" Without another word, Martin rose and left, leaving Henry alone with the weight of a secret he'd kept from himself. He stared blankly at his reflection in the glass, seeing not the man he had become but the man he once was, the man who had caused this pain. Later that evening, as Henry sat alone in his penthouse, the depth of his remorse washed over him. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the echoes of his past decisions. He knew what he had to do, even if it risked losing everything he'd worked for with Annie. She deserved the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. The next day, Henry asked Annie to meet him in the park. It was a clear autumn morning, the air crisp, with leaves falling in warm hues. They sat on a bench near the pond, the calm surroundings a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. Annie looked at him, sensing his unease. "Henry, is everything all right?" He took a deep breath, the words catching in his throat. "Annie, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have known a long time ago." She watched him intently, her expression softening with concern. "A long time ago, when I was building my company, there was a small town we expanded into. We set up a factory, and in my rush to grow, I ignored the consequences." His voice cracked as he continued, barely able to meet her gaze. "Your husband's town, Annie. The factory, the waste, it was my decision. I was responsible." The color drained from her face as she absorbed his words, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Henry, are you saying you were the reason we lost everything?" "Yes," he whispered, his head bowed in shame. "I didn't know. I mean, I knew about the town, but I didn't know it was yours. I didn't know you." She stood up, backing away from him, her hands trembling. "You're the reason he struggled, the reason we had to leave. I've spent years trying to rebuild my life, Henry. And you were the one who made it crumble in the first place." "Annie, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice desperate. "If I could go back, I'd undo it all. I'd give anything to change what I did." But she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's too late for apologies, Henry. My husband is gone. The life we built is gone. And now, I don't even know if I can look at you." She turned and walked away, leaving Henry rooted to the spot, his heart breaking as he watched her retreating figure. The weight of his past sins bore down on him, and he knew that he might have lost the one person who had made him believe he could change. As she disappeared into the distance, Henry felt the emptiness settle in, deeper than ever before. He had spent his life building an empire, but all the wealth in the world couldn't buy back the trust he had shattered. In the days following his confession, Henry's world felt empty and desolate. Each morning, he woke with a hollow ache in his chest, a reminder of what he had lost and the pain he had caused. The vibrant colors of fall that once filled him with a quiet joy now felt muted, as though the world around him reflected the grief in his soul. The foundation, his penthouse, even the city itself. All of it seemed meaningless without Annie. For the first time in his life, Henry felt the full weight of his actions bearing down on him. Relentless, crushing force that refused to let him move on. He'd spent decades building walls of wealth and influence to shield himself from consequences, but now there was no hiding from the truth. He was the cause of Annie's suffering, the reason her life had been torn apart. The knowledge was a torment he couldn't escape, even in the silence of his penthouse at night. Unable to bear the emptiness, Henry threw himself into work, hoping to distract himself from the loss. He attended endless meetings, signed off on projects, and sat through board discussions, but nothing filled the void. Every face he saw, every room he entered, reminded him of Annie. Her quiet strength, her gentle smile, the way her eyes held compassion despite the challenges she'd faced. And now, he had destroyed any chance he'd had with her. A week later, he found himself at Ashton Charities, walking the halls as he once had, but now feeling like a stranger. He passed by Annie's empty desk, the sight of her chair and belongings still neatly arranged tugging painfully at his heart. She hadn't returned to work, and no one knew if she would. Lost in his thoughts, Henry was startled when he heard the familiar voice of Rachel, one of the foundation's managers. "Mr. Ashton," she said, her voice hesitant. "I don't mean to intrude, but I thought you should know. We received a notice this morning that Annie's son, Ben, needs additional support at his school. It's a funding issue. They can't provide the resources he needs." The mention of Ben struck Henry deeply. He remembered Annie's stories about her son, her pride in his resilience, and her fierce determination to give him a better life. If nothing else, Henry knew that helping Ben was something he could do. A small step toward redemption, however inadequate. "Let's cover the cost," he said immediately, his voice steady with a resolve he hadn't felt in days. "Whatever the school needs, make sure Ben gets it. And keep this off the record. No publicity, no headlines." Rachel nodded, looking at him with a mixture of respect and understanding. "Of course, Mr. Ashton." Afterward, Henry returned to his office, but the hollow ache persisted. He realized that simply writing a check wasn't enough. He needed to take real responsibility for his past. He needed to face the consequences and find a way to truly make things right. Not just for Annie, but for every person he'd harmed along his climb to the top. That evening, Henry sat in his penthouse, gazing out over the city skyline, the lights flickering like distant stars. He thought of all the people affected by his decisions, by the factory he had authorized, and the damage it had caused. The sense of guilt weighed heavily on him, but beneath it, he felt a glimmer of something else, a fierce, growing determination to change, not just in words, but in actions. The next morning, he called an emergency board meeting, instructing his directors and foundation heads to gather in the conference room. As he entered, there was a palpable tension in the air. The team had noticed his recent withdrawal and sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Henry took his seat at the head of the table, his gaze steady as he looked at each person present. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice firm but filled with remorse. "Decisions I made years ago harmed communities, families, lives. And it's time we confront those mistakes." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Henry continued, explaining the full extent of the factory incident, the environmental damage, and the human cost. He described the hardship faced by Annie's town and others like it, towns that had been devastated by his ambition. His voice cracked at times, but he pushed through, refusing to hide the shame he felt. "What I'm proposing," he said, "is a full reparative initiative. Ashton Charities will fund restoration projects in these communities, from environmental cleanup to rebuilding local economies. I don't care how much it costs. We will make it right." One of the board members spoke up, her voice cautious. "But Mr. Ashton, such an initiative could affect our bottom line. It's a substantial investment." Henry met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "This isn't about profits. This is about integrity, about owning up to the consequences of our actions. I've spent too long ignoring the harm I caused. It's time to change that." The room fell silent, but Henry could see something shifting in the faces around him. A reluctant respect, a recognition of the gravity of what he was attempting. He didn't care if it was difficult, or if it would strain his resources. He was prepared to face any obstacle if it meant making amends. As the meeting concluded, Henry felt a strange, bittersweet relief. He knew that even this would not erase the pain he'd caused Annie, but it was a start. He was no longer running from his past. He was facing it head-on, determined to create a legacy built not on power but on redemption. That evening, as he left the office, he spotted Annie standing by the elevator, her expression guarded. She hadn't spoken to him since their confrontation, but the look in her eyes told him that she had heard about his announcement. They stood in silence and then, with a voice barely above a whisper, Annie said, "Maybe it's not too late to change." Henry nodded, his heart aching with both regret and gratitude. He knew he had a long journey ahead, but for the first time, he felt he was walking in the right direction. Henry's promise to make things right marked the beginning of a profound transformation in both his life and the work of Ashton Charities. Gone were the days of distant philanthropy aimed at polishing his reputation. Now, his purpose was clear: to confront the harm he'd caused and rebuild what he had broken, not just in dollars but in trust, compassion, and respect. His first major act was to visit the small town where Annie had once lived, the place he had so easily signed away in the name of profit. The town looked just as Annie had described in her quiet, pained way, struggling, weary, as though the years of hardship had seeped into the very soil. Abandoned homes and neglected shops lined the main street, the skeletal remains of a once thriving community. Henry felt a pang of shame, so deep it stole his breath. These people, this town, they were living with the consequences of his ambition, his relentless drive to build an empire. Henry was accompanied by a small team from the foundation who had been briefed on his intentions. Together, they met with community leaders, former workers from the factory, and families who had suffered the most. He listened to their stories, each one carrying a weight of struggle and loss. The people were understandably cautious, some openly resentful. To them, Henry Ashton was just a name, a faceless villain responsible for the destruction of their home. But gradually, as he sat with them and listened without interruption or defense, he saw a few of their expressions soften. They weren't looking for an apology alone. They needed to see action, a tangible commitment to their healing. One evening, he attended a town meeting, standing before a group of residents who still bore the scars of his decisions. His hands trembled as he took the microphone, an unfamiliar vulnerability spreading through him. "I am here because I made mistakes," he began, his voice steady but somber. "Mistakes that hurt all of you, that damaged this town and tore families apart. I won't pretend that an apology will fix everything, but I want you to know that I'm here to do whatever it takes to make amends. Not for the headlines or the tax write-offs, but because I owe it to you. I owe it to Annie Foster and her family, and to each of you." Silence filled the room as the townspeople watched him, their eyes a mixture of skepticism, bitterness, and faint hope. But for the first time in his life, Henry didn't care what they thought of him. He was no longer there for approval. He was there for redemption, and he would earn it the hard way. Over the following weeks, Henry personally oversaw projects to rebuild the town's infrastructure. The foundation funded environmental cleanup efforts, provided grants to local businesses, and supported educational programs for the town's children. He spent long days meeting with residents, ensuring that each project was implemented in a way that reflected their needs and wishes. In the evenings, he often stayed in a modest motel nearby, exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose that no corporate deal had ever given him. One day, as he was supervising the setup of a new community center, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Henry." He turned to see Annie standing there, her face softened but unreadable. She had come to visit her old hometown, and he could see the memories in her gaze as she looked around, her expression tinged with both sadness and pride. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope seeing her there, as if her presence was a sign that he was truly on the right path. "Annie," he greeted her, unsure of what else to say. She looked around at the construction, watching the workers lay the foundation of the new center. "I heard about everything you're doing here. The people are talking, you know? They're starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things can get better." Henry swallowed, emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel rising within him. "I'm doing this because it's the least I can do, Annie. For all of you, for Ben and for you." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting back to the construction. "Ben," He asks about you, you know? He keeps asking why you haven't come by. The mention of her son stirred something profound in Henry. He hadn't wanted to intrude, especially given everything he had put their family through, but hearing that Ben still wanted to see him gave him a renewed sense of purpose. "If he'll still have me, I'd like to see him," he said softly. Annie looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, and she nodded. "I think he'd like that." Later that week, Henry visited Annie in Ben's small apartment in Queens. Ben greeted him with a shy smile, his eyes lighting up as Henry handed him a book he'd remembered Annie saying he liked. The boy led him inside, showing off his room with the innocent enthusiasm of a child eager to impress. As they sat together, Ben spoke with the candor of youth, telling Henry about his school, his friends, and his dreams of one day being a writer. Henry listened intently, struck by the boy's resilience and imagination. Here was someone who had faced adversity but had not allowed it to steal his hope. Henry couldn't help but feel a growing affection for him, a paternal urge to protect and support him. After they'd shared a meal, Henry found himself sitting with Annie in the small kitchen, the air filled with the warmth of shared silence. Annie looked at him, her gaze softened by a depth of emotion he couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you for coming tonight, Henry," she said quietly. "Ben looks up to you, you know. He sees something in you that even I couldn't see at first." Henry nodded, his heart full. "Annie, I know I can't undo the past, but I want to build something better, something that honors all of you." She reached across the table, her hand resting on his. I'm starting to believe you, Henry." In that moment, he realized that his journey of redemption wasn't just about rebuilding the town or making amends. It was about becoming the man he wanted to be, the man who deserved Annie's trust and Ben's admiration. And for the first time, Henry felt that, despite his mistakes, he might finally be on the road to something true. The days grew shorter as winter approached, but in Henry's heart, a warm light had begun to glow, faint but steady. His efforts in Annie's hometown were bearing fruit. The new community center was bustling with families. The cleanup efforts had restored the once polluted river, and the people were beginning to believe in the future again. The gratitude he saw in their faces made him feel a sense of fulfillment he'd never known, a validation that had nothing to do with wealth or status. But his thoughts always returned to Annie. She had become his touchstone, the reason he'd begun this journey of self-discovery and redemption. And while they'd begun speaking again and rebuilding a tentative friendship, he still sensed a barrier between them, a hesitation in her eyes that reminded him of the pain he'd caused. He was determined to overcome it, not with words, but with actions that proved his commitment. One evening, Henry invited Annie and Ben to join him for dinner at a small restaurant near her home, a cozy spot with twinkling lights and rustic charm. Annie agreed, and as they sat together, Henry felt a quiet joy at seeing them, as though he were beginning to taste the life he'd unknowingly longed for all along. Ben chattered excitedly, telling Henry about his school projects and the books he was reading. Henry listened with genuine interest, amazed at how this small family, once so fragile in his life, had come to mean everything to him. After they'd eaten, Ben excused himself to the restroom, leaving Henry and Annie alone, a comfortable silence settling between them. "Thank you for coming tonight, Annie," Henry said softly, looking into her eyes. "I know it hasn't been easy for you to trust me again, but I want you to know, I'll keep doing this, keep working to make things right, no matter what." Annie looked down, her hands resting on the table, a faint smile touching her lips. "Henry, you've already done more than I ever expected. But trust is difficult for me. It's not just about what happened to my family, though that was a big part of it. It's also about letting myself believe that change is possible, that people can be different." Henry reached across the table, his fingers grazing hers gently. "I understand," he murmured, "but I'm not giving up, Annie. You've shown me a kind of life I never thought I could have, a life I want to build. Not just for me, but for you and Ben." Her eyes softened, and he saw a glimmer of the warmth she'd once shared with him, a fragile but unmistakable opening. They sat there, hand in hand, letting the moment speak for itself. a quiet exchange of hope and healing that didn't need words. As they left the restaurant, the winter wind biting but invigorating, Henry walked them home. Ben chatted animatedly, but Henry and Annie exchanged quiet glances, each one filled with meaning. When they reached her apartment building, Ben dashed inside, leaving Henry and Annie standing alone on the sidewalk. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" she asked softly. Henry nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves. As they entered her modest apartment, Henry took in the details: the well-worn couch, the photos on the walls, the signs of a life lived with love and resilience. It was a stark contrast to his sterile penthouse, and yet it felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever known. They sat on the couch, an easy silence settling between them. Annie glanced at him, her gaze thoughtful. "You know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "there was a time when I couldn't even imagine speaking to you again, let alone inviting you here. But I see now that people really can change." Henry reached for her hand, holding it gently between his own. "Annie, you taught me what it means to care, to really care, in a way I never knew was possible. I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the pain I caused. But more than that, I want to be someone worthy of you and Ben." Annie's eyes filled with emotion, a mixture of gratitude and tenderness that he hadn't dared to hope for. She leaned toward him, and he closed the distance, their foreheads touching as they shared a moment of quiet understanding. "Henry, I don't need perfection," she whispered. "I just need you to keep being honest, to keep trying, even when it's hard. We're all a little broken, and maybe that's why we fit together. Overcome." Henry pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time, he felt truly whole, not because he was invincible, but because he was willing to be vulnerable, to face his flaws and still find love on the other side. After a while, Ben peeked into the room, grinning at the sight of them. "Are you two, friends now?" he asked, his eyes alight with curiosity. Annie laughed, brushing her hand over Ben's hair. "Yes, we're friends, Ben. Good friends." Henry nodded, feeling a surge of warmth as he looked at the boy who had come to mean so much to him. "And maybe one day, we'll be even more than that," he said gently, glancing at Annie, who smiled back at him, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. As the evening wore on, they talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories, their laughter filling the room. Henry felt a peace he hadn't known before, a deep contentment that came not from success or wealth but from connection, from the love that had taken root in his heart. Later, as he walked back to his penthouse, he knew he had finally found his way home. He didn't need the opulent surroundings, the accolades, or the power he'd once craved. All he needed was the trust and love of the people who had given him a second chance. And with that knowledge, Henry felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was no longer alone and that he was finally the man he had always hoped to be. Months passed, and the winter snow blanketed the city in a quiet hush. Henry's transformation had touched every corner of his life. Ashton Charities was thriving, and he had restructured the organization to ensure that its work was rooted in genuine service rather than corporate gain. Projects expanded, not only in Annie's former hometown but across the country, addressing environmental, educational, and housing needs in neglected communities. Henry felt a sense of fulfillment he'd never imagined possible, a purpose tied to people and not profit. But it was the moments with Annie and Ben that filled him with the most joy. What had begun as hesitant reconciliation had blossomed into a love anchored in understanding and forgiveness. Annie and Ben became regulars in his life, and Henry cherished every moment, from Ben's impromptu stories to quiet dinners with Annie. They had become his family, a part of his life he had longed for without even knowing it. One Saturday evening, as the three of them sat around Henry's dinner table, now filled with laughter, conversation, and warmth, a sense of home settled over him, so complete and profound that he almost felt unworthy. The boy, who'd once viewed him as a stranger, now saw him as a friend and confidant. And Annie, the woman whose life he had inadvertently broken, had somehow allowed him back into her heart. After dinner, while Ben busied himself with a book in the living room, Henry and Annie stepped onto the balcony, the city lights sparkling like stars against the night sky. The air was crisp, and Henry wrapped his arm around Annie, drawing her close. "This feels too good to be true," he murmured, looking down at her with a tenderness he never thought he could feel. She smiled, her head resting against his shoulder. "Sometimes life gives us second chances," she replied softly. "And I think we were both ready to take one." Henry turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Annie, I want this," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I want you and Ben in my life, not just as visitors or friends, but as my family. You've shown me a life I never thought I deserved, and I want to be here for you. For both of you." Every single day, a tear slipped down Annie's cheek, but her smile was radiant. "Henry, you're already part of our family. Ben adores you, and so do I." She took a shaky breath, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never imagined we'd be here, together like this, but you've shown me that people can change. You've shown me what love and forgiveness can build." Overcome with gratitude and love, Henry leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers, a quiet promise passing between them, unspoken but deeply understood. This was their second chance, and they were both ready to make the most of it. In the weeks that followed, their lives became joyfully intertwined. Ben stayed with Henry on weekends, filling his home with a warmth it had never known. Annie began helping with projects at the foundation, her insight guiding Henry's vision in ways he deeply valued. Their relationship became the anchor of his life, a steady, grounding force that reminded him of the path he had chosen. One spring morning, Henry surprised them with a small ceremony at a nearby park. Under a canopy of cherry blossoms, he took Annie's hand in his, vowing to love and protect her and Ben for as long as he lived. Ben stood proudly by their side, grinning from ear to ear, thrilled to be part of this new chapter in all their lives. The ceremony was simple, with only a few close friends, but it was filled with the kind of joy and authenticity that Henry had once thought impossible. Together, they moved into a modest home just outside the city, a place where laughter filled the rooms and love anchored every corner. Henry's wealth was still there, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it became a tool to enrich the lives of others, a means to bring joy, hope, and healing to people who had once been forgotten. As summer drew near, Henry decided to revisit Annie's hometown, bringing her and Ben along to see the fruits of their hard work. Walking through the town, they saw the bustling new community center, freshly painted homes, and the playground filled with children's laughter. Residents waved, some stopping to thank them, their faces lit with gratitude and relief. Henry couldn't have asked for a better moment. This town, which had once carried the scars of his ambition, now stood as a testament to the power of redemption. Standing there with Annie and Ben, he felt the profound peace of a life rebuilt, not from the ruins of failure, but from the soil of love and forgiveness. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Henry and Annie stood by the river, watching the water flow, clear and serene, a symbol of their journey. Ben ran ahead, skipping stones and laughing, his voice echoing against the stillness of the evening. "Look at him," Annie whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I never thought I'd see him this happy." Henry wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "This is all I've ever wanted, Annie. A life filled with meaning, with love, with you and Ben." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with tears of joy. "And it's all ours now, Henry. We've both found our way home." As the stars emerged, dotting the sky with their quiet brilliance, Henry felt as if he were seeing his life in a new light. Every mistake, every regret, had led him here, to this place of peace, love, and family. He finally understood that true wealth wasn't in what he'd once amassed, but in the lives he had touched, the hearts he had healed, and the love he had found along the way. And with that knowledge, Henry embraced the life he had chosen, a life built on redemption, forgiveness, and the quiet, unshakable bond of family. The years passed gently, each one adding new chapters to the story that Henry, Annie, and Ben were writing together. The quiet suburban home they shared had become a sanctuary, a place where love grew in abundance and laughter filled every corner. Seasons came and went, each one marked by memories they cherished. Summer picnics, winter snowmen, autumn leaves piled high for Ben to jump into. In spring gardens, Annie and Henry tended together, their hands entwined in the soil. Henry never forgot the life he'd left behind. The empire he once ruled with an iron grip, the relentless pursuit of success at any cost. But now, those memories felt distant, as if they belonged to a different man. His journey of redemption had transformed not only his actions but his heart, and in the years that followed, he used his wealth and influence in ways that reflected the man he had become. The foundation he'd built with Annie's guidance continued to grow, reaching communities across the country, restoring broken towns, building schools, and funding medical facilities. Annie had become an integral part of Ashton Charities, her compassion and insight guiding the organization's efforts. She brought her experiences and the lessons of resilience to every meeting, every project, ensuring that the foundation never lost its humanity. The team, once skeptical of Henry's new direction, had embraced Annie wholeheartedly, recognizing the strength and authenticity she brought to their work. Together, they transformed the foundation into a true force for good, a legacy of compassion that would continue to shape lives for generations to come. As for Ben, he thrived in ways neither Henry nor Annie could have predicted. The boy who had once carried the weight of loss and uncertainty had blossomed into a vibrant, curious teenager, his dreams as big as his heart. Henry became not only a father figure but a mentor, sharing stories from his own life, lessons from both his mistakes and triumphs, guiding Ben with the wisdom he had gained through his journey of transformation. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned shades of red and gold, Henry found himself on a familiar path. He and Ben were taking a road trip upstate, visiting the town where Annie had grown up, where their journey had first intersected. The town had changed significantly since Henry's early days of philanthropy. The once struggling community had revived, and the people had rebuilt with a strength that honored their resilience. They strolled through the town center, where small shops now lined the streets, vibrant and welcoming. Local families waved, recognizing Henry from his many visits over the years. But what truly warmed his heart was the sight of Ben, now a young man, greeting the locals with an easy familiarity, as if he, too, belonged to this place of healing and growth. Their final stop was the community center, a building that had become the heart of the town. Inside, children were playing, their laughter filling the hall. Henry watched as Ben joined them, showing them games he'd brought along and sharing stories that made them giggle and cheer. The sight brought a smile to Henry's face, and he felt a profound gratitude for the life he'd been given. A life that, against all odds, had become one of connection, love, and purpose. Later, as they drove back home, Ben turned to Henry, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if you hadn't, changed?" Henry smiled, glancing at Ben. "I think about it often," he replied, his voice steady, "but not with regret. I don't think of it as a different life. Really, I see it as part of the journey that led me here. I needed to go through all of it to understand what truly mattered." Ben nodded, a quiet understanding in his gaze. "I'm glad you did," he said simply. "I'm glad you're here." They returned home to find Annie waiting on the porch, a welcoming light in her eyes. Henry wrapped his arm around her as they watched the evening sky, a soft dusk settling over the neighborhood. This was home, a place where love had taken root, where dreams had grown from seeds of redemption, and where hope had blossomed into the life they'd built together. In the years that followed, Henry's legacy continued to flourish. Ashton Charities expanded internationally, bringing aid to regions affected by conflict, natural disasters, and poverty. But Henry never sought recognition or praise. His work remained quiet, guided by Annie and the principles she taught him: humility, compassion, and service. Together, they established scholarships for young leaders, programs to support small-town businesses, and grants for environmental restoration. His past mistakes had been woven into the fabric of his work, turning scars into strengths, lessons into legacies. One spring, Henry received a letter from the town's mayor, inviting him and Annie to a celebration of the community center's anniversary. They accepted, and the visit turned into a family gathering that brought back memories and joy. To Henry's surprise, the townspeople had named the center in his honor, a tribute not to the man he'd once been, but to the man he had become. The plaque on the wall read, "In honor of Henry Ashton, for healing, for hope, for home." Standing beside Annie, their hands entwined, Henry felt the weight of his journey lift, leaving only a sense of peace and fulfillment. This was his legacy, the life he'd chosen, the love he'd found. And as they returned to their quiet home that night, he knew that the story they'd written together was more than a tale of redemption. It was a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the unwavering belief that people, given a chance, could indeed change. Years later, as Henry and Annie sat on their porch, watching Ben leave for college with his own dreams, Henry felt a deep, abiding contentment. The boy he'd once met as a stranger was now his son. The woman he'd hurt was now his partner in life. And the world he'd once viewed as a game of power and success had become a canvas for healing, love, and legacy. Together, they had built a life that would echo beyond their own years, touching lives they'd never meet and hearts they'd never know. And for Henry, that was more than enough.